Welcome to the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast number 36. What does it mean to be an elder? A conversation with Lynne Iser. I'm the producer, Jim Burke. In this compelling episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations, Dr. John Izzo and co-host Alain Gauthier delve deep into the profound questions surrounding elderhood. Joined by Lynne Iser, they explore the roles and responsibilities of elders in our society. The conversation centers around two fundamental questions. What does it mean to be an elder, and how can elders become activists at this critical juncture in human history? Lynne Iser is an advocate for elder activism and the board president of the Elders Action Network. With a distinguished career spanning public health and social services, Lynne has dedicated her life to fostering community resilience and intergenerational dialogue. She played a pivotal role in developing the Spiritual Eldering Institute with Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi, which evolved into Saging International. Lynne's activism began with the free clinic and home birth movement of the 1970s, where she worked to reshape social structures and to promote holistic health practices. A graduate of Cornell University and the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston, Lynne has made significant contributions to public health, such as developing one of the first farm trails map and established the long-standing Arcata Farmers Market. She founded Elders Activist Org in 2013, a platform that inspires and supports elders to engage in creating a just and thriving world. Lynne contributed to the documentary film Praying with Leor in 2004, an international award-winning film that changed the way people with disabilities are included in places of worship, featuring her son. Since 2016, Lynne has served as president of Elders Action Network, advocating for climate action and empowering elders to play a crucial role in addressing societal and environmental challenges. Lynne's work extends to creating platforms for meaningful conversations, such as the Women Standing for Peace initiative, which brings together Palestinian and Jewish women to advocate for nonviolence and understanding. She has been a consultant with Creating Elders Communities since 2003, encouraging older adults to use their wisdom and resources to build a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. Her lifelong dedication to social justice, community building, and environmental sustainability makes her a powerful voice in the movement for purposeful aging and elder activism. We would like to thank our sponsors, Elders Action Network and Elders Climate Action. And now for our host, Dr. John Izzo and Alain Gauthier.
Hi, I'm Dr. John Izzo, and on behalf of my co-host, Alain Gauthier, and our producer, Jim Burke, I want to welcome you to this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast, where we explore important issues facing humanity and society and planet, especially from the perspective of those over 50, and how we can engage in these issues in our time, and at the same time, have purposeful aging, so that we can make a difference not only for society, but for ourselves. And whatever age you are, we welcome you. It's great to be here. So, Lon, I'm really excited about our conversation today, because today, we spend a lot of time in our podcast talking about the over 50s, the over 60s, about the elders and elders as activists and purposeful aging. But today we're going to really focus on two questions. First of all, what is an elder anyway? Is an elder just about how old you are? Is an elder about how wise you are? Is an elder about how you act and what you do? Is it about your inner life? Is it about your outer life? What does it mean to be an elder? And second, what does it mean to be an elder activist, especially at what some would argue is a particularly critical moment for humanity in terms of our evolution, both of society and of the planet itself? So I'm really excited about this. And I was thinking of two experiences, one from 15, 16 years ago and one from last night. I was thinking of 16 or so years ago when I had the privilege of spending time with my good friend Richard Leider, who's been a guest on our show, in Tanzania, camping out in the Serengeti and among hunting gathering tribes in Tanzania. And I was thinking about a particular experience I had with the Iraq tribe, not that's IRAK, not IRAQ, not as in from Iraq, but in Tanzania. And we happen to have the privilege of meeting with the Council of Elders in this tribe. And they explained to us that in that particular tribe, when you became 50, man or woman, you automatically became a part of the Council of Elders. So age was the moment. And in a society where people lifespan is less than ours, it makes 50 really made a lot of sense. So at 50, they would become a part of the Council of Elders. And we said, well, what's the role of elders? Well, we're kind of the keepers of the wisdom. And when there are important decisions that the tribe has to make, they come to us for counsel. We don't so much make the decisions, but they come for us to counsel. So then the head of the tribal council asked me the question, so how does the Council of Elders work in your society? I said, well, it doesn't exactly work that way. Like in our society, often when you're 50 or 55, the organizations start like shopping you out for early retirement to make room for younger people. And a lot of older people don't even live in the communities where their families are. They often wind up in homes, so not living, with their families, but often in homes for the aged. And for the most part, people don't seek the wisdom of elders in our society. To which he said to me through a translator, well, basically, you got to go back and kick butt and, get those young people to listen to you. Well, I thought, well, that's probably not going to work. It did wind up being the inspiration for my book, The 5 Secrets You Must Discover Before You Die, where I interviewed these 250 people over the age of 60 with 18,000 years of life experience, but only one thing in common, and that was that someone identified them as the wisest older person they knew. So through that book, I tried to channel that wisdom, but I've stayed with that question, over the years. And so I'm really excited we're going to explore today. What is the role of elders in our society? The second was an experience I had just last night when I went out to dinner with a good friend of mine and to a concert, beautiful concert. She's dating a new guy, and this was a chance for me to meet him. Janice couldn't join us. And of course, he asked me, what do you do? And I was asking what he did. And I was talking about my work on elders and the Elders Action Network, where I'm on the board. And our guest today is the chair of the board of the Elders Action Network. And he said something really interesting. He said, my parents just turned 70 and they're both retired. And my dad especially, work was such an important part of his life. And now he's really lost. He could sure use something like what you're doing, something that he could get involved in and feel like he was making a difference. So with those two context pieces, really excited about the conversation and our guest today. So Alain, over to you before we invite Lynne to join us.
I'm too very excited by our conversation. I had the opportunity to clarify what it means to be an elder. I'm 84 now, and I had the opportunity to clarify what an elder is or might be or could do by joining Elders Action Network. So it's really privileged to have you, Lynne, join us for this conversation.
Welcome into the Way Forward podcast studio. We're excited you're here.
I'm excited to be here. First of all, it's nice to hear a little bit about your own backgrounds here and the stories you bring forth, because they just already spurred some thoughts in my own mind. So I'm really interested in getting into this conversation together.
Excellent. And Lynne is someone that Alana and I both count as a friend. You heard it in the introduction, but I'll remind you, she is, among many things, the chair of the board of the Elders Action Network, and of course, their sister organization, the Elders Climate Action, both of whom are co-sponsors of our podcast. So Lynne, let's get right into it. We're going to talk a lot about your journey and your life, but I'm going to start really at the high level. What to you is an elder? What is the definition of an elder?
I think it's a really important question for us to struggle with in our time, because we don't have role models for elders. The only role models we might have are the elders in a church, perhaps, which has a certain connotation. I know in the Old Testament, there was a point when God told Moses, you should do this for the people, but you need 12 elders to help you. Like, don't think you could do it by yourself. So that was an interesting thought, that here was this newly branded leader with a newly branded tribe, and the first thing they did was get a bunch of elders to help him. So it's worth like musing on this a little bit. From perspectives is that an elder is a very subjective term. Like what could be an elder for one person or for one culture? It's really a cultural term, might not be for others. So I've been looking over the years at other cultures to see, just as you talked about earlier, how do they see elders in their society? When I've spoken to Native Americans, they say, well, once somebody becomes old, they become an elder. But we don't ask all of them to come. We don't go to all of them for advice. So we give them all respect. But we wouldn't go to any elder, the person that's a little bit of an awkward person, or the town drunk, or the person that hasn't been responsible. That might not be the person I would go to when I have advice. So they too have a sense of, although offering the respect that comes with years of life experience, being able to say, you have to earn the title. You have to earn the respect within the community. I don't want to say title, because I think that many of us now that are striving to discover our elderhood want to have honor and respect and almost demand it. And yet we can't demand it. I think it kind of seeps in and oozes in. You started earlier about saying, what is an elder and at what age? So I started thinking that elderhood really began at 50. That was a Jubilee year in traditional societies, or in the Bible, which is my heritage. And part of the Jubilee year was setting yourself free, or setting the culture free from what had been before. And so you rang the bell, as we have the Liberty Bell here in Philadelphia, and the slaves were set free and the land went back, and there was a whole bunch of provisions. So I thought for myself, so how does that work for me as somebody entering the 50th year? And this was 24 years back already. And I thought, well, you get to drop some of the stuff you've been walking around with. Maybe some of the shoulds, maybe some of the I have to's, maybe some of the I must meet this expectation, or I have to be this way, and do a little of your own inquiry. That doesn't mean you become an elder immediately. Just like any stage of life, there's a maturation process. And we've talked about this before, and it'll be fun to get into a little bit later on. But so it's a process. It's a process.
A couple of things I hear you say, and Alain, love you to come in here, is first of all, there may be elder with a small e and a big E, and even in indigenous societies, or that tribe in Tanzania, the Iraq tribe, even though everyone over 50 got to kind of have that honor. Look, you've lived, you have experience, we give you your respect, you get to join the council. Probably not everyone is the person they went to for advice. So we don't have to earn the little e. But the big E is
Right.
more an earned position. It's where people would say, I want your wisdom for this. And, I was thinking when you were talking, one of the maybe big differences in our time, and Alain, I'd love your take on this too, is that in a lot of indigenous societies, the elders with a little e and a big E were kind of the keepers of the tradition. The things that people had learned about hunting, learned about the seasons, learned about the cycles.
Right.
But, a lot of younger people today might say your experience as elders is bad experience. You've helped create, I hadn't planned to say this, but they might say, look, you guys messed it up, right? We don't want whatever you learned about running a society. So we don't really want that. So I think one of the challenges in our time is that they may not want us just to be the keepers of the tradition. They may need us to actually be wise, but also innovative. In other words, to change how we see things. So Alain, come in, and then I'd love your response.
I just said to myself, I am becoming an elder when I was 74, right after liver transplant, where I had the sense to almost, with the risk of not making it much further, say, I am now in service in a way I've never been before. So yes, at 50, I had a little more maturity, but having been a coach and a facilitator most of my life, I realized that I was so identified with that work that I needed to stand back and, as you said, Lynn, let go of some things so that there would be more space for me to be an elder in that sense of being of service to the larger whole. So that would be my take on what you said, that sense of being available to possibly help guide others, but in a spirit of humility, because we know we have made many messes sometimes in our life. I certainly did. And so, but the sense of being able to stand back and say, well, among some of these, there may be some things that could be useful to others, but mostly I'm here to listen in a new capacity of being of a service.
Elaborate on that just a bit, because I think it's really important to think about the mistakes that we've made, or our generation just made a lot of mistakes. We also had a pretty big playing field. You know, we had probably one of the largest playing fields of most generations, and it's only increasing. So part of our work of becoming elders is being able to recognize, where have I been successful in my life and where have I not been successful in my life? What have I messed up? What if my relationships aren't quite as resolved as I wish they would be? Or where do I need to forgive myself? I did the wrong thing, but I learned from it. So where do I need to forgive myself? And we want to do this in our personal relationships. For sure, we want to clean up those personal relationships before we come to the end of our days, if we have the opportunity to do that. But I think we also have to do it as a cohort. And if what we can offer the younger generation is to say, you know, I tried doing that, and we thought we were doing the right thing, but we discovered it wasn't. And let them learn from our mistakes. And maybe that be part of our wisdom. Many times people ask, what is wisdom? And wisdom isn't just kind of like a crown you get because you're old and smart and have the right words, but it's born of reflection. It's born of the ability to look at what has happened and work with it, as you said earlier, that we need to not only forgive ourselves, we need to be able to see a picture that might not have been what we thought was going to happen, and take out those nuggets. Where's the truth of what happened? You know, I wasn't so nice and this is the result. Well, maybe I'll learn to be nicer. Or I tried this and this happened. Well, I have to try something different, and I really want to try something different. So that's the wisdom that we can offer too. And we have to offer it with an open hand. Because younger people aren't always ready, or they might not need what we have to offer in that moment.
So it sounds like we all agree about around 50, you're in the club, right? Meaning and it may be, as we're all reflecting, it's because of things that happen in your life. Your kids are of a certain age, your career is at a certain stage,
Absolutely.
your finances may be at a certain stage. You realize, whether it's your liver or something else, that, oh, I'm not going to be around forever, right? You know, and we're going to dig into some of your history and your life as an elder and an elder activist in a moment, Lynn. But I was thinking of something you said was really important about our generation, is the baby boomers in particular are really a unique group of elders in certainly North American society, but I would argue in Europe as well and Australia, in that it's the only generation where there were no great wars and no great depression. If you think, meaning in modern history, think about our parents and their parents' generation, who lived through 2 wars, a Great Depression, really global unrest, and the Cold War and the post-industrial North American economy and later Europe really gave us, as you said, not just a playing field, but the wind was behind our backs in terms of demographics, economy, world order, because the Cold War, as dangerous as we thought it was, actually created a kind of global stability, albeit kind of checkmate. But anyway, so what does it mean? I know you come from the Jewish tradition, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But I came out of the Christian tradition, and Jesus said, unto whom much is given, much more will be required. So one wonders, like, the generation that had our wind at our back our whole lives, what does it mean to now be elders? And what does the world require of us, given how much, over half the wealth in America is still in the hands of the baby boomers? Think about that. Over half of the wealth in America is in the hands of this generation that had the wind behind their backs. depending on how you define activism, in my mind, you've been an activist your whole life because you grew up in a Jewish family, in a Jewish community where philanthropy and giving and community and being involved was a part of it. You got involved in kind of more the social services work, as I understand it, early in your career. But you told me you really weren't an activist in the traditional sense when you went to Cornell, though you said your husband was now husband, weren't married to him then, was an activist in that sense. So tell us a little bit about your career journey and what that early life was like for you in university and your early career in terms of thinking of yourself as an activist or a do-gooder, maybe.
Okay. Well, I just want to reiterate, I did not really think of myself as an activist through most of my life. I was certainly a child of the 60s. I was born in 1950 and I went to college in 68. So I was in that generation that, experienced all the upheaval that I think many of us experienced at some part of it. My activism was very much around creating new social structures. So how do we actually relate to the other sex in a more open way? Do we have to get married in order to have a career or to have children or to own a home? The first time I bought a house, I got to put in my name and it said Lynne Iser, a single woman. I went, whoa, that's really exciting. And it was exciting because women did not own homes by themselves back in 1975 as a rule. Certainly there were outliers, but so that was a very exciting moment for me. So my activism was more in the lines of how do we look at the social structures in our country and where can we, how can they evolve? I was very much part of what was the free clinic movement in Northern California, and it spurred me on to go to graduate school in public health. I became part of a network in the community to build a farm trails map. Was one of the early farm trails map where you go to find your food. We started the Arcata market on Saturday mornings, the farmers market, which is a very long-standing farmers market. So these kinds of things that kind of rewove the agriculture world, the food world into our lives was a very important part. And also as we related to each other, the home birth movement, that was certainly of my era as well, women's rights, all that. And then I had a child and I got busy and I had a career and, life played itself out until I found myself with more time because I didn't have to be home doing homework every night or driving a child somewhere, so I have to be there to make dinner. And I could find myself going to more meetings or going to city council meetings or finding ways in which to really raise my voice. But I did it very much in response to my teenage daughter, who at about 14 or 15 looked around and just kept saying the world is a mess. I wish I was born in the 1950s. I wish I had been able to have your life. Because I look around and at that point it was climate change was just, we were becoming very aware of the species going extinct, and she's a very emotional person and very sensitive. And I could see the pain this was causing her. And I began to understand my responsibility to her and to her generation to get out there and do something, because she was now busy going to school. She was going to be busy building her life. I had the time to kind of maybe fix my life or fix the world around me. And I began my own inquiry about what went wrong. And I think that's something a lot of us feel that are now in our 70s and early 80s and 60s. Like, I thought democracy was good. Like, what do you mean it's broken? Or I'm not a racist. What do you mean we're all racist? I don't understand that. And so we've come kind of age to our maturity of this time of life to find out that many of the foundational structures of our society were not quite right and didn't quite serve us. And so we sit with a lot of, I think, confusion, denial, maybe a little bit of certainly despair. How could you not be in a place of despair? But certainly some denial and confusion about the state of the world and how did it happen. So I think that's a hard part for many of our generation.
And no doubt that the we talked about that on a recent podcast with the Change the Chamber, some younger people who are involved in, climate activism and in a variety of ways. And we really talked about the anxiousness of this generation, right? And I think many of us, it's the anxiety of our children and our grandchildren about what's happening in the world. That's often the door, isn't it? The entry point where we see, wow, because, it's interesting. I feel like as I'm a younger baby boomer, slightly younger than you two, so I was born in 1957. So I went to school in 1975. Watergate was behind us. The war was behind us. And there was, the Cold War was there. So you're still worried about nuclear war, but there was a sense of like, okay, now we can go get a job and like life is going to be good. Maybe these crises are kind of behind us for now. I think seeing that anxiety in our generation, that's economic as well as existential.
Absolutely.
It's a powerful thing. But now you got thrust, and Alain, I'm going to get you in a minute around this same question. Really curious when each one of us kind of got interested in this question of an elder and an elder activism. And what really struck me, Lynne, was that, you kind of chose and got thrust into the world of elderhood when you were only around 30. When you had an opportunity to go to Philadelphia and work with Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi, or Reb Zalman, as he's affectionately called, who is not with us now in this life, but who started an organization called Saging International, harvesting the wisdom of our lives, finding ways to transmit that wisdom as a legacy to future generations. So tell us about that experience when you're only around 30 of moving to Philadelphia to be involved in elderhood
Right?
at that young age. So what attracted you about that? And tell us what that experience was like.
Okay. Well, first of all, I was almost 40. So
okay. Sorry.
You're off by a decade, which is an important decade because I had my son and started a career, and I was going through my own spiritual inquiry, like, how do I do this? Childbearing, what's important to me? So Reb Zalman, as we do affectionately call him, had started a movement of Jewish renewal. And it really spoke to me as a person that had been raised in a traditional home because it looked at Jewish values and it questioned, like, how do these Jewish values apply to our lives now in this 20th century? This is the late 1900s. So what do they mean to us now? So, for example, what does kashrut mean now in terms of how we treat animals? Could chickens raised in a chicken farm and never go outside, is that a kosher chicken? Is that even possible? Because we're not honoring the life of that chicken. We're causing it harm. So we don't have to go there, but I was intrigued with that idea. It's like, how can I make my Jewish tradition alive again for me? And I was fortunate in that he was looking for somebody to work on a project with him, which he called the Spiritual Eldering Project. And I was interested in moving east. So we kind of he offered me a job, and I moved to Philadelphia to help him develop the Spiritual Eldering Institute that grew into what is now called Saging International. And that was about 34 years ago. So there I am, 40 years old. I am just kind of coming into my real mature adulthood. And I get to go to workshops all the time with people that are in their 60s and late 60s, and they're thinking about their elderhood and learning about how to become an elder, how to do the inner work of becoming an elder rather than just growing old. And so all through my 40s, I was kind of marinated in this conversation and these teachings and this research. I was creating exercises and rewriting his talks, and not rewriting his talks, but English wasn't his first language, so it needed a lot of grammatical help, editing help. So I was deep into all this work as I was approaching my 50s, and I felt very grateful. Most of my friends were dreading turning 50, and I said, oh, it's okay, don't worry about it. Everybody says it's better. It's more fun, you're more relaxed. It's like, it's really an important time of life, and it's very meaningful. Just don't stress it so much. So that was how I came into this work, and I'm so grateful that I had that introduction. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I want to come back in a moment and talk about an aha you had though as you were doing that when you said, "Oh, that's." But Alain, just curious, what first attracted you to this kind of idea of elderhood, or the elder movement?
Well, much later than Lynn. I mentioned the hiccup in my health, that the
Mhm.
fact that I almost died made me look more closely at my own mortality and what about the rest of life? If
Right.
I'm if I stay, and that was kind of a mantra I held in the hospital, if I am still alive for a few more years, what am I going to dedicate my life
Mhm.
to? So this inner quest, but which would found an outer quest, possibly. And I found it as I joined the EN. So I'm wondering, the focus of Rabbi Zalman work was very much on the inner journey, the fact that it seems manifesting itself in wisdom. So when and why did you become interested in that idea of elder as an activist?
Well, I think one of the drawbacks of a lot of his work was that he was a spiritual leader and a really brilliant man. So he knew the psycho-spiritual world, and that was where he was most comfortable being. And although he talked about activism and the need for elders to be out there in the front lines and to create legacies and to transmit their wisdom, he didn't have kind of the practical experience of how do you do that in terms of facing the issues of the outer world. So sometimes we wonder, like, do you need to do the work of eldering to be an activist? For many people, you do need to do that inner work. Like for you, facing your mortalities was a wake-up call to how do I want to live my life, right? That's a very important part of the process of becoming an elder is facing our mortality. So if you face that mortality and you decide, oh, I'm not going to be young, I'm going to get a face job, or I'm going to do whatever else you want to do to deny that, that doesn't help you. But if you can face it and it encourages you to really delve into your life and harvest your life experience and your wisdom, then it's been a very, as it was for you, a moment of blessing, a moment of being able to turn and to transition. So when we look at the outer world, and as I said, I was forced to do with my daughter, and what a mess it is, as an elder, we have to say, what's my responsibility? So we talked a little bit about what an elder is, and in my thoughts, an elder is an individual who recognizes their responsibility and their role. The role of an elder is to ensure the well-being of future generations, to create a legacy from our life experience, to create whatever wisdom or whatever we want to pass on from our life experience to future generations so that they can thrive. And it's clear that we aren't doing a really good job of that right now. So we have a lot of work to do. Our generation has a lot of work to do because somehow we're not ready to pass on a thriving, just future to the younger folks. Now, it might not be our response, it might be not our response, but our fault. We live in a very tumultuous time, and as an individual, that's kind of overwhelming. Like, it's not my fault, the world's a mess. But not being our fault doesn't mean that don't have a responsibility to address it. And I think that that's what the work that we can do together all through the spectrum of our elder years. And I just want to say that turning 50 or 60 and becoming an elder is not the same. We already see it's not the same for the three of us. You in your mid-late 60s, my 74, and you 84. We have different needs. We have different perspectives because of where we are. And we have to honor that. It's just not the same. And I feel myself making a turn along from my elderhood of the last 10 years to what I think might be my elderhood for the next period of time. So there's movement as we grow older. We're not static people. There's a lot, especially if we stay conscious and connected with the world around us and with ourselves, like what's yearning to come forth from inside of ourselves. Where's our personal need for becoming? We're still becoming. So it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, one of the things, and go down this rabbit hole for a moment and come back to, I want to come back to what you did after the work with Good Rabbi, but want to piggyback on something that you said, which is, Eric Erickson, who of course is famous in the 1960s. He didn't die into the 1990s, but he did in the 1960s this work on the stages of human development. And we don't have time to go through all those stages today, but the last two stages that he talked about were really this period from about 40 to 60, which he talked about the main work of that time of life, again, from his perspective in the 1960s, was about generativity and the shift to contribution to society and a bit away from the self. And he looked at this period after 60, where he said the main work was, he said, this tension between in what he called in integrity or despair. And by integrity, I think what he meant was just integrating your life's work, your life's journey, making peace with it, and transforming that not into regret and into despair, but into, that kind of maybe deep wisdom that would carry you over the final threshold is one way to think about it. And it seems to me one of the tensions of being an elder is that it is a time when both are important. There's a great, I forget the author who said, when he was in this age group, said, I vacillate now between my desire to savor the world and my desire to save the world. So there is tension isn't the right word, but there isn't in this age, like on the one hand, it is a time of integration, of making sense of one's own life, of making peace with it, of doing the inner work that prepares you for the, what's to come, to do that one thing we only get to do once, as far as we know, that every human must do, which is to face our mortality. And yet, on the other hand, there's this other calling, as you said, to save the world, to contribute before you go. And I'm wondering, I've certainly experienced that tension in my own life, right? So there's a part of me now that wants to go even more deeper into meditation, more deeply into yoga, more deeply into contemplation, more deeply into savoring every beautiful moment. And yet I also feel this deep calling to do what I can while I'm alive. For me, not just the next generation, but for life itself. Because for me, it's bigger than just like the human generation, for life itself. But and I know that's true for you guys too. So talk about that. It's not a tension, but there is, both those things happen for us as we get older.
So one of the things that's important to remember is that we're not unique individuals. We're part of a web of life. We're part of Gaia. We're part of this largest system. Sometimes the largest system is our families or our communities. We're certainly living, breathing systems are part of Earth herself. So I just want to set that as a stage, because one of the ways in which I believe that this integrity is important is that in order to go over that final threshold, as you called it, we want to do it in a state of integrity. And one of the things that we will rest easy with is knowing that we have given over we have transmitted whatever wisdom we might have. And I say whatever wisdom, because it is whatever wisdom. It doesn't always seem like such wise, holy words, but I'll give you a few examples in a few minutes. So that passing on our wisdom, passing on our life story, passing on what is important to us, whether it be in conversations or in building a farm and passing it on, is what gives us a sense of completeness, integrity, and I think immortality. So we don't talk about immortality very much anymore. It used to be something that people really talked about. Really, Ponce de Leon, he went for the fountain of immortality or something, right? I think that's where we get our immortality. So one of the privileges of being older is you get to see younger generations. And my parents have passed on now almost 15, 20 years ago. My oldest sister did as well, but I have her daughter with whom I'm very, very close. She's 19 years younger than I am. I remember being a college freshman and her being a little infant and how much I just loved playing with her. Well, now she's in her 50s and she's got children that are processing themselves out of college and beginning their love affairs, and who knows what will come soon. But I see these generations and I see my grandniece's generosity and a kind of a wisdom that comes about how to relate with each other that comes from their mother. And that I know comes from my grandmother, right? It comes from her mother, it comes from my mother, and it comes from my grandmother. So when I was a child, my grandmother died when I was 9 months old. So I never knew her. This was my mother's mother. But whenever my mother and her sister would get together, my dear Aunt Sarah, and they talk about their mother, they go, Mama, she was such a kind lady. She never did anything to hurt anybody. Well, that was my legacy from my grandmother. Was I learned like, oh, if you don't do things to hurt people, people say nice things about you. Well, that's a good thing. I want that. But I also see that that kindness has come down through the generations, right? So I can see some of my personality traits in my own son and in my other children. And I sometimes wonder, I know they came from my grandmother, but where'd she get it from? Right? She must have there's some value that came to her about being kind. Now, it might have been a really mean person in her life that she says, I'm not going to be mean and nasty. I'm going to be a kind person. But she still received that as a teaching. And so that's part of what we pass on to future generations. And I think we want to be really careful about that in this stage of our life. We know that there's a lot going on in the world that really is trying, a mess, and so many dysfunctional. There's so many ways of saying it. Some of my senses, my beliefs is that it comes from we are losing our values, right? If we had stronger values, we might have better discourse about our democracy. We might have less wealth inequality. We would at least be talking about honesty and the importance of honesty. When we started talking about alternative facts, I went, what? You can't have an alternative fact. There's a fact. And there's fiction. There's really not alternative facts. There might be different truths to life, but a fact is supposed to be a fact. This happened on this day and at this amount of money, or whatever it is. Facts are supposed to be pretty much facts. So we're muddling with the values that are important to hold a society together. I think that's part of what we as elders need to bring up. I was raised with a lot of sense of character. My mother wouldn't talk about what Mrs. Cohn did as work, because Mrs. Cohn probably didn't have a job, but she would talk about Mrs. Cohn was kind or truthful or caring or generous. And that was how we kind of considered our community. And who you were to go to for advice, going back to who would you go to if you wanted advice from an elder, you'd likely go to the one that was kind and caring and had done well in their life. So those things are really important. And I think it's part of what we can bring forward from the past in terms of our wisdom.
Beautiful, Lynn. I was wondering, you have been involved in the work of Joanna Macy and Pachamama, as I have, less than you. And so would you tell us about how that work is relevant to what we are discussing now? It's great unraveling, great turning, and the role of elders or people someone in their midlife and then in their elder years, how they can perceive what is theirs to do.
Well, thank you for bringing that in. I want to start. I was thinking about it because I don't want to get too off stream here. So first I want to say that I did a lot of work with the Pachamama Alliance 10 or 12 years ago. And their work really brought me to a lot of understanding about where we are now in the world. It was very pivotal for me. One of their phrases they use is unintended consequences. And so when I started looking at the world and I said, well, it's a mess. What did we do? How could we have been so stupid? Just to put it bluntly, you learn that there are unintended consequences. So that's a little bit easier to understand that, we weren't malintentioned, but we didn't understand what was going to happen. So, now we have a little bit of hopefully more perspective on what our actions might do and how important that is. And we know the Native Americans have this teaching about seventh generations. And I think it's such an important teaching to bring in as often as we can, that we should look at what the impact of our actions might be 7 generations in the future. And that's a big look, but it's a good thing to keep around when winding our way through our lives. But Joanna Macy has really been a very important teacher for me in many ways. Learning a lot about systems theory and how we all wind together. But as you said, her own teachings about where we are in the world. She says there's 3 stories of our time. There's business as usual, which is what we see happening in the world right now. There's what we might call the great turning to a life-sustaining and thriving culture, which is what many of us want. And then there's the great unraveling. And 10 years ago when I started this work, I was set that we weren't going to have that great unraveling. Well, we are experiencing the great unraveling. And we see that as we look around and we see, species dying off, the coral reefs dying off. We wonder the impacts of weather and climate and all of what's happening in the world, as well as other kinds of unraveling, like what's happening in our democracies and in our governments and leaderships, and how do we hold all this? And what we are seeing is that systems are unraveling and they're all interconnected. If we are going to live through a period of unraveling, there's going to be a lot of distress. And we're seeing that right now. Many of us experience a great deal of fear, great deal of despair, and just a host of other emotions and feelings. And how do we hold those feelings? What do we do with them? Can they serve us in any way? And I think that's what I feel like that's what I need to go in my eldering. I think that you're heading there as well, Alain, that it's time for us to really start listening to each other. That we need to sit down and hear each other's stories, and we need to witness each other's pain. And we need to be open to each other's suffering as well as our own. That there is a lot of suffering. And when we can be honest about it, it frees us up. Especially not only being honest, but to know that somebody else is listening to you and that you're being heard and witnessed and seen. And that kind of unblocks the feedback loops. So instead of squishing things down and doing the inner work inside of ourselves to make us feel impotent or inept or small, or we can't, whatever it is that keeps us in denial, once we open that up with each other and we can support each other and hear from each other, we can perhaps see with new eyes, which is a part of her journey. Yes. And see the way to go and feel our energy to go forth, and perhaps have the strength and the courage and the determination to do just that, because there's a lot of work for us to do and it's not going to be easy.
And she also stresses, as you well know, the importance of grieving. Yes. And grieving is difficult to do just by oneself. So right. The importance of community or some form of community is key. And that's what we are trying to create with the regenerative elder process, is to create a community where it's okay to grieve together and also look at what can we do with new eyes.
Right. And we don't want to forget the first part of her work, which is about gratitude.
Absolutely not.
Because that is the foundation of our love for this world, our love for others, to recognize just what a blessing it is to be alive. And to be, especially for us in my life, I have so many blessings. So how do I use those blessings rather than feel responsible that I have more than others, which of course is something to address, but not to just feel overwhelmed by them, but to say, I'm going to do something with this.
I was thinking of a bunch of things firing for me. Thank you to both of you. And I was thinking about one of the real questions maybe people may be asking, maybe people listening going, I can see, first of all, it's really important for me to live those values, right? To be a kind and compassionate person, as you really beautifully described, Lynne, about how one of the gifts that we give to the world, to our own children, our grandchildren, people younger in community, is seeing that grace in us, that kindness, that compassion, and doing the inner work that, that Erickson talked about integrity versus despair. But then there's this question of, is that enough now, right? Like David Hawkins, who many of you familiar with his work, who's a physician and a kind of spiritual guru, though he would hate that I call him a spiritual guru. But, he is one of those lectures I heard him say, stop worrying about saving the world. The world is perfect, just the way it is. Be kind, be compassionate, step over the beetle instead of stepping on it. Raise your level of consciousness and the world's will change. But it's interesting, in that same lecture, he talked about how Gandhi, who was at a very high level of consciousness, meaning he had done the inner work for his own consciousness, stood up to the British Empire and in many ways helped lead a movement to stop colonialism around the globe, right? A turn happened in colonialism after the revolution, the peaceful revolution, if you will, in India. Right. So I know, Lynne, one of the things you did when you finished with, your work at the end of your work with the rabbi, was started this website for elders as activists, and then later with John Sorensen got deeply involved in the Elders Action Network that emphasized not just doing the inner work and being a kind and compassionate, transformed person and raising your level of consciousness, but in your own way being a Gandhi, is the way I would put it, meaning to actively be involved in the world. So talk a little about that shift for you. And why is it important for people listening that it's not enough to be kind and compassionate and decent and step over the beetle, as David Hawkins said, or to pass kindness on to your children or grandchildren? Why in this moment is the world asking, in my words, for each one of us to kind of be a Gandhi and step forward in our own way to be more active than just that? You may or may not agree with me on that, but I think you do. So
I totally agree with you, John. Totally agree. I think there's several reasons why we need to do that. One is a personal reason. As I said, for us to leave this world with a sense of well-being, or I've done it, or I'm okay, ready to pass over that threshold, I need to feel like my legacy is whole. And I can't feel that now. There is not a legacy that I'm leaving to future generations that is thriving or just, in my words. Now, I might have taught my children to be honest and kind and generous, and I think that I've done that on a personal level, but that's not enough. We live in a world, a really big and impressive and powerful world here in the United States. I think it's incumbent upon us to use our voices and raise our voices for the well-being of all. I think we need to get out there in that public square. And that public square could be your city council office. It could be your dining room table with friends. It could be in your church or your synagogue. But raising your voice and saying, we have to work for the good of all. We have to work for the well-being of all, because our economic system's a mess. There are too many people that are poor. When I go to Washington, D.C., which I do occasionally, I think it's so shameful that I'm stepping over people that are sleeping in the streets. How can we call ourselves a great nation if we have people that are sleeping in the streets of our capital? That is shameful. And we have to have a sense of shame. We can't just accept this stuff. We are one of the largest industrialized nations, and we have an enormous level of child poverty. That's just not right. And there is a right and a wrong. That's wrong. There are some things that are right and wrong. That's got to be wrong. So there are things that we need to do, that I am called to do. Now, it may be different for all of us. We might all find our ways of speaking what is the good of the community, what is for the welfare of 7 generations, of future generations, of the world around us. So we're each somewhat unique, and we get a different perspective and take on how to do this. But our responsibility and our role as elders, which I firmly believe, is to care for future generations. So when I was at Standing Rock, that must have been 4 or 5 years ago now, I got to speak with some of the native elders there, and I asked them about, what does it mean what is your role as an elder? And they just said immediately, it's to care for the children. It's to care for the children. They didn't talk about wisdom. They didn't talk about councils. They didn't talk about rituals or ceremonies, and other people, of course, too. But it's to care for the children. And we have to keep that front and center, because the children represent the future generations.
When they said the children, they weren't just talking about my biological offspring. They were talking about the children, meaning the tribe, the community. And I think that's one of the challenges. We have a lot of people listening say, hey, I'm looking after my children and my grandchildren. But that's not enough, because our children and our grandchildren are going to, first of all, be in a society where a lot of things are going to impact them that are bigger than just to them, but also extending that responsibility. So right? They meant the children, they meant the children of the community, not just my children.
Right. But self-interest is very important. Yeah. Self-interest also serves the greater good.
Of course, exactly.
I've said this many times. My Well, I raised 5 children here, and they all went to different kinds of high schools, but some of them went to private schools and got really amazing educations for whatever reasons. But I've recognized that I don't have to just make sure that my children have an education. They're still going to get older. They're going to be in their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and have their children. And if the people around them in this city aren't educated and aren't able to have jobs and feel like the only way they can support themselves is by stealing from somebody or by taking something from somebody else, or that's not taking care of even my child. So by taking care of all the children, that's the responsibility to the welfare of all. And the welfare of all ensures that everybody gets something, right? So that everybody gets to live a decent life. Everybody gets to have enough food. Everybody gets a place to live. They might not all be equal, but at least they all get a chance. They each get an education, and that serves my own children as well as it serves the children that live in other neighborhoods that are, might come from a different socioeconomic class. So we have to keep that our community is wide. I'll tell you another story. This is what I've learned. This is one of the images I have about being an elder and how we support the younger generations. So I think that part of our work is to stand behind the younger generation. And now that I'm in my mid-70s and I don't want to do some of the work I've been doing previously, I go to a lot of actions, demonstrations, events called for by younger people now in their 20s and 30s. And they're smart and they're motivated by their passion for their life going forward. And our question is, how do we support them? How do we stand behind them? How do we offer them whatever it is that we can, with an outstretched hand? So when I first got to Standing Rock, our very first night there, we were invited to a presentation in a church, and the church was completely full. It must have had a couple hundred people in there. And one of the leaders of the Standing Rock encampment, and I forget which of the leaders it was, a beautiful, distinguished looking Native American woman that just had such presence. And she greeted people and thanked them for being there and talked about the importance of what was happening at Standing Rock and why they had started. It actually had started on her land, and thanked people, and then said, and I want you now to listen to these young people, these people here that are coming from this community. They need to share with you and tell you about what they're doing and why it's important. So please listen to them really carefully. And then she stepped back and stood against the wall with 2 or 3 other people and listened to these other people's presentation. And it was such, a stamp of support to say, this has value. It's not me. It's not my 70 years of experience. It's not the person you know. But I can tell you, I think these younger people, this idea, this project is really worthy of your attention. So please give them your full attention and support them. This is what we need for our tribe. This is what we need going forward. So I try to hold that, and I'm seeing that more and more as of my 5 children, one of them is truly an activist and is in her early 30s, and she's here in Philadelphia. So they drop in every so often with their friends, and they really want to be able to tell us what's going on. They really want to feel accepted for who they are, for their kind of outlier understanding of the world and the fights that they're fighting. And most of them don't get it from their parents or their, the communities from which they come. And they're so grateful when they can talk to elders, share what they're doing, and hear a little bit about our experiences, what it was like for us, and maybe where we didn't do so well, where we kind of messed up. So listen, let me tell you where I didn't do so well, because maybe you won't make the same mistake, or maybe you'll figure it out yourself.
And many of us who are involved in, as you are, not just raising children, but involved in education as elders, that it is a reciprocal gift.
Oh, yes.
We learn so much by listening to them, as well as maybe there is something of value they can offer them. And that indeed is one not every elder will want to get involved in that. But I think there is a sense of young people are closer to the mystery in a way because they haven't lived that longer life yet.
Mm-hmm.
And they are open to things that are right. And
Mm-hmm.
elders are closer to their own death and the other part of the mystery. And so the possibility of a reciprocal view
Mm-hmm.
on how we elders can help and be helped by younger people.
Yes. I had this idea a couple of months ago that, I was listening to my husband. My husband's a wonderful person, but he reads the New York Times and he reads too many papers all the time. So he's always telling me how things aren't working.
There's
He's
something
very
to be
aware of
said
what's
for
happening
avoiding the
let me
news.
tell you what's happening in the Antarctica or what's happening here. I'm going, I don't want to know. I just can't. Right. So I got this kind of understanding that sometimes younger people have really almost preposterous ideas. And we tend to say, oh, it won't work. We tried something like that and it didn't work. Or let me tell you what's not working. And that limits us. We know all the things that could go wrong after 60 or 70 or 80 years of experience, because we've seen so many things go wrong. And yet they're coming up with new ideas and they need to have their fires nurtured. They need to have their fires fed because they will come up with creative ideas. A lot of them won't work, but they didn't work for Einstein either, but we want them to keep trying. So we have to let them come up with the new ideas while we offer them what we can to support them and guide them, but certainly not to cut them off or to say no, unless we really know that no is what they need to hear, which should come pretty infrequently. But, I think it's so exciting to be able to work with the younger generation now.
So, John, maybe it's the time to wrap it up. Unfortunately,
yeah. So just a quick comment on something you said earlier, Lynn, that really connects to that is that, we're going to have to innovate. And innovate here, I don't just mean technology, but innovate our social system. Peter Senge says the definition of a system problem is that the outcomes that are being created are not what the vast majority of the individuals in the system would choose. And you kind of hinted at that earlier, right? That what we have right now is not even for example, the lack of civility and the divide in America. I'm guessing there's almost no one who would vote for that, right? If you said to people on the right and the left, I'd like to live in a divided society, where we can't talk to each other and have conversations. We can't figure out problems and solve things, together. Would you like to sign up? Yeah, a few extremists would, but most people, no, I didn't sign up for that, right? So that's going to require the innovation, and a lot of that's going to come from younger people who are not wed to the existing system that has produced outcomes, right, that we don't want. So you're right, Alain, time touched us lightly. So Alain, why don't you ask our favorite closing question to Lynn? Yeah. Our guests love and hate this question. So go ahead, Alain.
We asked that of all our guests. How do you personally try to live a regenerative life?
That's a great question, because you and I have had many conversations about what regenerative means. I think I'm coming into it more than ever. I think I used to live more of a sustainable life. So putting my clothes on the clothesline when I can, having a garden, stepping over the beetle, having a local food co-op, being a part of that kind of a life that is in community, that is focused on community values more than individual values, to see that, it's in community that we are going to thrive and be strongest. Now I'm beginning to think okay, so what am I giving over? What am I giving over, and how am I giving that over? Right. So I have a granddaughter who just turned 6 yesterday, and I think it's so important for me to spend time with her. That it is good for her to have that perspective of another loving adult in her life that's actually a lot older than her parents and sees things a little bit differently. And it's good for her to have as much of that as she can have. It's good to think about, what is it that I want to pass on, and to dig deep into my values. It's not just the money I could pass on or the beautiful backyard, which is treasured by everybody in my family, but it's what are the values that I need to pass on that are bigger than myself? So one of the things I'm looking at now is the importance of conversations and resilience. How do we really listen to each other? And I'm looking for ways in which we can have more of those kinds of conversations. How do elders come together that might come from very disparate backgrounds and share something in common and go forward, like understanding each other? So one of my local projects now is through a very dear friend of mine, is Women Standing for Peace. And it's Palestinian and Jewish women that are getting together. And we're just standing to say the violence must stop. We're very careful not to have a political agenda because we really want to not divide ourselves because there's so many divisions from where we come from. But just to be able to understand that the violence must stop. We must care for the children, that this is just not right, allows us to get into a little bit of conversation with each other and hear where we're each coming from. Why do they feel the way they feel? Why do we feel the way we feel? What has their life experience been about? It's not solving the problems. The problems are not going away, but we have a little bit more understanding and a wider perspective. And maybe that is really where wisdom comes from. Maybe there's something there that we can pass along. And, I just hope that we can. I don't know what's demanded of us other than to show up, to hold our values and to care for other people and other people in the widest sense. And if we can do that at our age, I think there's something of value in our life that could be regenerative and we could pass on, and that might be helpful to future generations that don't have that as the soup that they're swimming in or having for dinner. So I don't know.
Well, Lynne, what a beautiful end to a beautiful and ongoing conversation. So first of all, thank you for being our guest. More importantly, thank you for your life's work and your continuing work as an elder activist, both at the Elders Action Network and in all your other endeavors, including the last one, to listen deeply, even when we have differences, and to wage for peace, which I love. I'm glad you shared that. I hoped you would. And just to remind you, our guests, that Lynne is the chair of the Elders Action Network, one of our co-sponsors, along with the Elders Climate Action Group. And I encourage you to go to their websites if you want to get involved. It's a great place to get involved. A couple of things just as we leave our conversation today. One is I go back to my experience with the elders in the Iraq tribe in Tanzania. And, they ask, so what is the role of elders in your society? And I think it's a question each one of us must ask, both individually and collectively. What do I want my role as an elder to be? And I think we've had a beautiful conversation today about what that means in the outer and in the inner life. And what will be the legacy of this generation of elders, this group, which will be the largest cohort of elders as a percentage of population in human history in the developed world? And what will be the legacy of this particular group of elders? And it's something that each one of us must answer individually, but ultimately collectively. Mm-hmm. And Alain, you gave me a beautiful insight that I didn't have before, which is, and you alluded to it, Lynne, that when you said you realized when you were working with these older people when you're in your 40s and people said, oh, I'm turning 50, that's horrible. You said, no, they're happier. So we know the research shows the U of happiness. You're happiest like in your 20s and then your early 30s. Then through midlife, you get less and less happy. And then finally, when you get older, you get happy again. But Alain, you gave me like one of the reasons. Part of it is, okay, in the optimism of youth, midlife, you're raising the kids and, et cetera. And then, you come to a different stage. But you said something really profound. Young people are closer to the mystery. They've just come into the world. They have a naivete and a connection to the mystery. You said, as we get older, we're again closer to the mystery, to our mortality, in the sense that we are joining the oneness from which we came. And maybe in midlife, we lose that sense of our connection to the mystery. So thank you, Alain, for that beautiful insight. And finally, thank you, our listeners. You're why we're here. If you like what you heard, please pass it on to others, subscribe, and let them know so we can spread these important conversations. If you like what you've heard but think we can do better, we'd love to hear from you. And reminder, we're now on YouTube, on Instagram, and podcasts, audio podcasts, wherever you find them. So you can find us in a lot of different ways. And we have a website coming very soon, and we'll announce that in one of our upcoming episodes. So for now, we always like to remind you, the future is not a destination waiting for us to arrive. We are creating the future that we and the next generations will arrive at. So we should do so thoughtfully. For now, we'll see you next time on The Way Forward.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. You have many choices, and we appreciate your interest and support. We want to hear from you. Please reach out to us at thewayforwardrc@gmail.com with your thoughts and feedback. Your input helps us create a podcast that you want to listen to and share with your friends. If you have guest recommendations, we would love to hear those as well. A special thank you to our sponsors, Elders Climate Action and Elders Action Network, who are building a movement of elders to address the environmental, governance, and social issues of our time. You can learn more about their work at eldersaction.org and eldersclimateaction.org. Until next time, I'm Jim Burke, and this is the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, and Amazon Music. You can watch us on YouTube. In parting, may I wish you a regenerative present and future.